To many standing in the sunshine that cool November day, there was an eerie feeling about the place. It was quiet now, except for the droning voice of the speaker at the podium, and the fields that stretched for miles around them were all empty and hushed. Still it seemed as if the sounds of battle still hovered, and if one listened closely, one could hear their ghostly echoes. The screams of the wounded, the agonizing moans of the dying, the explosions of guns and cannons, the yell of the battle cry, and the sobs of men who were watching their comrades, their leaders, even their own brothers and sons, being killed before them. It had been 4 months now since the most frightful battle of the Civil War had been fought outside the town of Gettysburg. The battle had turned the course of the war towards an inevitable Union victory, but at a terrible cost to both sides. Over 40,000 soldiers had been buried where they fell, blue and gray together. Then there had been a movement to have them reburied and their graves marked, making Gettysburg a national cemetery. At the dedication ceremony this November day, a well-known orator named Edward Everett had been asked to give the keynote address. Then the president had been asked to add a few words. Everett had been speaking for 2 hours to a large crowd that had grown accustomed to the elaborate speeches typical of the 1860s. Just the same, when he finished, the crowd was beginning to get restless. They paid little attention when their tall, lanky president, in his black clothes and high silk hat, took the flag-draped platform. He adjusted his spectacles, briefly scanned his 2 sheets of paper, and began to speak. He had started writing his speech at home in Washington, but he was still scribbling away at it when his train rattled into Pennsylvania that morning. Now he was afraid his speech would be an anticlimax after the long oratory of Everett. He began, his high, twangy voice reaching out to the crowd, his eyes sometimes leaving his paper to make contact with his audience. But the attention of his audience wandered. Few absorbed what he said, and when he finished, only 2.5 minutes later, there was only a smattering of applause. Lincoln was distressed. "I ought to have prepared it with more care," he said later. When he returned to the White House, the president felt ill and feverish. He had been tired now for a long time, a very long time. His friends had advised him to get some rest, but he'd said, "The part that is tired is inside, out of reach." Now his doctor diagnosed a mild case of smallpox and sent him to bed. In that bed the next morning, he read the newspaper accounts of his speech. Most said it was unremarkable, even trivial. It would be a while before the speech at Gettysburg would be recognized as the masterpiece it is, one of the simplest, most beautiful summaries of the higher purpose of the war and of America itself. The last lines of the Gettysburg Address are familiar to almost every person in America. "We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth." The speaker had predicted that his words that day would be little noted nor long remembered. He was wrong. The people of the United States have never forgotten the words spoken that November in Gettysburg, as war raged on between the North and the South. And they have never forgotten the man who spoke them and who saved the Union from division, President Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln is probably the most admired and best loved of all American presidents, and among the greatest, if not the greatest leader the country has ever known. He guided states through the most devastating experience in its history. He emancipated the slaves. He defined his country's goals more eloquently than anyone else since the Founding Fathers. He preserved the Union, and perhaps most importantly, he proved to the world that democracy can be a strong and lasting form of government. Besides all his achievements in government, Lincoln himself became a living symbol of the American dream, that anyone, no matter how humble their origins, can rise to their greatest potential and attain their highest aspirations. Lincoln was born, as the whole world now knows, in a crude log cabin on a farm in Kentucky. His family wasn't born in poverty, as many people believe. At the time, many people lived in log cabins, and the Lincolns were no better or worse off than their neighbors. The children were always well-fed and well-clothed. There were 3 children. The oldest was Sarah, and the youngest was Thomas, who died in childhood. In the middle was Abraham, born February 12, 1809. When Abraham wasn't needed for chores at home, he attended school in a log schoolhouse nearby, where he picked up a smattering of reading, writing, and arithmetic. He had gone to school, he said, by littles, a little here and a little there. Mostly he educated himself, he was famous among his neighbors for the way he would walk miles, sometimes as many as 20, just to borrow and return a book. His favorite books were Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, and Aesop's Fables. He also borrowed a history of the United States and some school texts. Later he developed a passion for Shakespeare's plays, long passages of which he could recite from memory. He also studied the Bible and always kept a copy of it on his desk at the White House. At night, when the terrible stress of his responsibilities kept him from sleeping, he would flip through the Bible and read different passages to himself. One of the books he read as a youth that left an enduring mark was a biography of George Washington that detailed the country's struggle for liberty. Lincoln said later, "I recollect thinking then, boy even though I was, that there must have been something more than common that those men struggled for." When Lincoln was 8, his family moved to Indiana, where there were better land deals, and where there was no slavery. Lincoln's parents belonged to a Baptist church that condemned slavery, and so from the beginning, said Lincoln, he was naturally anti-slavery, and could remember no time when I did not so think and feel. Life in Indiana was harder than in Kentucky. Young Abe helped his father cut trees, clear fields, build a cabin, and plant the crops. Though he was only a child, he was tall and strong for his age, and especially good with an axe. He would later refer to it affectionately as that most useful instrument. The first year in Indiana, Lincoln's mother died of what pioneers called milk sickness, probably from drinking contaminated cow's milk. Life on the farm became sad and dreary, with the 2 children working even harder, taking on the chores that had been their mother's. The following year, Lincoln's father brought a new wife to the farm, a cheerful, compassionate woman named Sarah Johnson, who had 3 children of her own. Sarah adored Abe. She encouraged his interests in education, nurtured him, and gamefully filled the vacuum so tragically left by the death of his real mother. Even as an adult, Lincoln called her "my angel mother." In Indiana, as in Kentucky, Lincoln scraped by with whatever education he could muster from borrowed books. He made his own arithmetic textbook and sometimes scratched out his problems on wooden boards, erasing them with a penknife. He described his early education this way: "There were some schools so-called, but no qualification was ever required of a teacher, beyond readin', writin', and cipherin' to the rule of 3. If a straggler supposed to understand Latin happened to sojourn in the neighborhood, he was looked upon as a wizard. There was absolutely nothing to excite ambition or education." Yet something internal clearly excited Abe Lincoln. His entire life he had about 1 year of formal education, but he was one of the most eloquent and literate writers and speakers to ever hold the presidency. Lincoln stayed on his father's farm until he was 20. By then he reached his full height of 6 feet 4 inches. He was thin, but he was big-boned and strong. He had a friendly, gaunt face, often considered sad, and a shock of black hair. Lincoln always thought of himself as a homely man, and early on he grew a beard in hopes of concealing his ugliness. Once in a debate, when his opponent accused him of being two-faced, he responded, "If I had 2 faces, would I choose to wear this one?" But many people saw a certain beauty in the wisdom and sadness of the Lincoln face. It was Henry David Thoreau who said, upon meeting Lincoln, that his face looked as if it had been molded by the hands of God. Lincoln, who had vivid dreams, many of them prophetic, once had a dream in which someone commented on how common-looking he was. His response in the dream was, "The Lord prefers common-looking people. That's why he makes so many of them." Lincoln was an amiable, modest young man with a knack for storytelling and a wry sense of humor. He made friends easily, but even when he was young, people spoke of the melancholy that seemed to haunt him. As he grew older, and especially during his years in the White House, he was prone to deep, dark depressions, some of which lasted for days. At the age of 21, Lincoln set out on his own and headed for the village of New Salem, Illinois, where he landed a job as a store clerk. It was a period without direction, without any sense yet of his great destiny. He described himself in these years of his early 20s as a piece of floating driftwood. When the store failed, he signed up to fight in the Black Hawk War. Black Hawk was a Native American who led several hundred others in a raid to reclaim the land they'd lost. Lincoln saw no fighting in the war, except what he called the bloody struggle with the mosquitoes and charges upon the wild onions, but he considered it one of the greatest honors of his life that he was elected captain of his company. After the war, Lincoln was still searching for a career and an identity. His friends encouraged him to run for the state legislature, which he did and lost. He bought his own store with a partner, but it failed after a few months. He was appointed postmaster of New Salem and tried that for a while. Then he tried his hand at surveying. He was efficient at both, but passionate about neither. He proposed marriage to a Kentucky girl named Mary Owens, but that didn't work out either. In her rejection, she said he was deficient in those little links which make up the chain of a woman's happiness. When he was 25, Lincoln decided to run for the legislature one more time as a member of the Whig Party. This time, he was better known in Illinois. He won and served 8 years in the Illinois General Assembly. As a legislator, Lincoln finally seemed to have found himself. He was quick and witty in debate and skilled at party politics. It was in the Illinois legislature that Lincoln made his first public statement in protest of slavery, calling it both unjust and bad policy. Membership in a state legislature was only a part-time job, and not one that paid very well. So Lincoln decided simultaneously to become a lawyer. He did this, like everything else in life, through his own initiative and studying. He borrowed all the law books he could and studied them until he felt he understood their principles. His advice to law students later was, always bear in mind that your own resolution to succeed is more important than any other one thing. When he was 27, he earned his license and moved to the state capital of Springfield to join the law practice of his friend John Stuart. Stuart once described his first impressions of Lincoln. He was the most uncouth-looking young man I ever saw. He seemed to have little to say, seemed to feel timid, with a tinge of sadness visible in the countenance. But when he did talk, all this disappeared for a time, and he demonstrated that he was both strong and acute. One of Lincoln's most famous law cases was when he discredited a witness who claimed he'd seen Lincoln's client committing a murder by the light of the moon. Lincoln produced an almanac that proved there was no moon the night of the murder, and his client was acquitted. Lincoln changed law firms a few times and finally settled down with a partner, William Herndon. He never dissolved that partnership, even when he was president. At his request, the sign above the office still read Lincoln and Herndon, even when Lincoln was in the White House. While living in Springfield, Lincoln began courting Mary Todd, a Kentucky woman to whom he'd soon proposed. It was a turbulent relationship from the start. Mary was high-strung and socially ambitious. Lincoln was introspective and given to moods. Lincoln broke off the engagement at one point, sure they wouldn't be able to make each other happy. But he was so depressed after this, an event he always referred to as that fatal 1st of January, that they reconciled soon after. The two finally married in 1842, when Lincoln was 33 and Mary was 23. It was a loving marriage and a devoted one, in spite of persistent troubles and challenges that increased dramatically during the White House years. Lincoln had regular episodes of melancholy, and Mary had a series of nervous fits and breakdowns. She occasionally had tantrums of jealousy and a temper that embarrassed Lincoln in public, and she spent their money so lavishly that her husband was often driven into debt. Mary was an unhappy First Lady. Her brothers were serving in the Confederate Army while her husband was commanding the Union, and as a result she was considered a traitor by some of the public and press. She also grew desperately lonely when Lincoln was forced to travel. After the death of one of their children, and after she witnessed her husband's assassination, she went insane and was admitted to a mental institution. The Lincolns had 4 children, all boys, but only one, Robert, would live to adulthood. Edward died at age 4, years before Lincoln became president. Willie died in the White House at age 11, and Tad died at age 18, a few years after Lincoln was killed. When Lincoln was 38, he ran for and won a seat in Congress, still as a member of the Whig Party. When his term was up, he returned to Springfield and took up his law practice with renewed vigor. By the 1850s, he was one of the leading lawyers in Illinois. He might have continued as a lawyer, and he might have never left Illinois, except for a sudden change in the national policy toward slavery that lured him once again into politics. The change was the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, an earlier bill that prohibited slavery in new territories. The new bill allowed settlers in the territories to decide for themselves if they wanted slavery. It had been introduced by a senator from Illinois named Stephen A. Douglas. Lincoln was outraged. Although not an abolitionist, he was strongly opposed to the further spread of slavery. Slavery, he said, was in violation of the American principles of equality and freedom. It will enable enemies of the free world to, in his words, taunt us as hypocrites. Determined to stop the new bill, Lincoln spearheaded a movement against Stephen Douglas and other politicians who supported it. When his own party, the Whigs, seemed split on the issue of slavery, he joined the Republican Party, an anti-slavery party only 2 years old. Then he accepted that party's nomination to run against Douglas for the U.S. Senate. His acceptance speech, given in 1858 when he was 49 years old, contains some of his most stirring and famous words. "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." Lincoln challenged his opponents to a series of debates, a series that made history for the way it gave prominence to the issue of slavery, and for how it brought national attention to Abraham Lincoln. Large crowds gathered for the debates, and the newspapers covered them with bold headlines. They were a colorful pair of opponents. Douglas, 5 feet 4 inches tall, smooth and polished, with a husky, well-trained voice, and Lincoln, nicknamed the Rail Splitter, a full foot taller with his earthy backwoods manners, a stride like a plowman, and a voice with a high-pitched twang. But it was more than Douglas versus Lincoln. It was slavery versus freedom. Lincoln lost the debates, and he lost the election, but he won something much larger. He had won the attention of the nation and of the Republican Party. In 1860, when he was 52 years old, they gave him the nomination for the presidency of the United States. In the 1800s, it was considered undignified for a candidate to do his own campaigning, so Lincoln sat back and watched while his followers did it for him. Their work was made somewhat easier by the fact that the Democrat Party split into two factions which competed against each other. In the end, Lincoln won all the electoral votes needed to put him in office, but more Americans voted against Lincoln than for him, and he lost the popular vote. Nearly all of Lincoln's popular and electoral votes came from the North. When he took the oath of office of President of the United States, it was already a nation divided. The first state to secede from the Union was South Carolina. It was followed quickly by 6 others, then 4 more. The Confederate States of America had been born, and for the first time in 100 years, the future of the Union was in doubt. In Charleston Harbor, in South Carolina, there was a fort that soon became a symbol to the American people of the sanctity of the Union. After Lincoln took office, the South seized federal forts within their borders and left Lincoln with some difficult decisions. Should he reclaim the forts? Should he strengthen the forts that hadn't been taken, like Fort Sumter? He knew that if he reinforced Fort Sumter, the South would consider it an act of war. Yet if he didn't, the North would protest. As a compromise, Lincoln decided to send just provisions to the fort, first informing the South of his intentions. The compromise didn't work. The South attacked, the fort surrendered, the Civil War had begun. The Civil War was the sole consuming business of the entire presidency of Abraham Lincoln. It was a crisis of such enormous import, and he poured so much energy and soul into resolving it, that by the time his 4-year administration was over, he had aged 20 years. The pictures of him before and after are the pictures of 2 different men. From the beginning, the war was far more than a battle to end slavery, and far more than a struggle to preserve the Union. To Lincoln, the United States was an experiment in a people's ability to govern themselves. If that experiment failed, for the rest of history, monarchs, dictators, and tyrants would use it as an argument against self-rule. To Lincoln, the entire future of democracy was at stake. The Union quickly gathered a large army and set out for the South, its soldiers convinced they could defeat the Confederacy in one battle. But in the very first battle of the war at Bull Run, the Union was defeated. Then it lost the Battle of Manassas. Very quickly, the North realized there would be no quick and easy victories in the fight to save the Union. Through the entire first 2 years of the war, the North faced setback after setback, and Lincoln, deeply frustrated, replaced one general with another. When the Union Army of General George McClellan drove back Robert E. Lee's forces at Antietam, McClellan then held back and refused to chase them. Lincoln sent McClellan a simple telegram: "If you don't want to use the army, I should like to borrow it for a while. Yours respectfully, A. Lincoln." In anguish over his inability to find a general who was aggressive, Lincoln replaced McClellan with General Ambrose Burnside. Burnside lost the Battle of Fredericksburg and was replaced by General Joseph Hooker. Hooker lost the Battle of Chancellorsville. Nowhere could Lincoln find a man with the willingness and skill to do what his commander-in-chief expected. And then a general with a taste for liquor and cigars, and a reputation for a tough attitude and a quick mind, began to turn the war in a new direction. General Ulysses S. Grant first made headway in the Mississippi Valley, taking Fort Henry and then Fort Donelson. Next he forced a Confederate retreat at Shiloh, sacrificing a large number of his men in the process. As time passed, the tenacity and courage of General Grant became more and more evident, until finally Lincoln put him in charge of the Union forces, and the tide began to change. The management of his army was only one of Lincoln's tasks. Meanwhile, he was also trying to give moral support and inspiration to the public. The public wasn't all of one view. Some were willing to fight to save the Union, but not to end slavery. Others felt the end of slavery should be the primary goal. Many of the soldiers in the Union Army had never seen a Negro, as blacks were called then, until they enlisted. Still, they were willing to fight for their freedom. The Civil War of America is the only war in the history of the world where one group of people fought for the rights of another group. From the beginning, Lincoln kept a moderate position on slavery, protecting it in the states where it already existed, but refusing to allow it to spread. During the war, he hoped this policy would keep the uncommitted border states, Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky, from joining the Confederacy. He once clearly stated, "My paramount object in the struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing the slaves, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." As the war dragged on, Lincoln's responsibilities were enormous. Work, he had earlier written to a friend, work is the main thing. In spite of the huge demands on him, Lincoln kept only a small staff and wrote most of his own letters and speeches. Every week he had an open house at the White House and spent hours visiting and listening to callers, all of whom had opinions, grievances, and favors to ask. During his entire 4-year term, Lincoln was away from Washington less than 1 month total. There were 2 sons living with the Lincolns in the White House, William, known as Willie, and Thomas, known as Tad. Tad, who had a cleft palate and spoke with a lisp, was Lincoln's favorite. He used to bounce the boy on his knee and tell him stories. Willie was closer to his mother. In 1862, both children became ill with fever, and Willie, only 11 years old, never recovered. Lincoln, deeply grieved, had no choice but to plunge back into his work. Mary Lincoln, however, was inconsolable. The death of Willie was the beginning of a downward spiral that eventually led to her complete mental collapse. About 6 months after Willie died, Lincoln became convinced that the time was right for a stronger stand on slavery. Without seeking the advice or approval of his cabinet, but informing them ahead of time, he wrote a statement that declared the freeing of all slaves in the United States. Then he waited for a Union victory, when the Northerners would be more receptive. That victory came with Antietam. 5 days later, Lincoln issued his history-making Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all slaves in states or parts of states in rebellion are and henceforth shall be free. It did not mention freedom of the slaves in the border states, but Lincoln encouraged those states to do the same and promised financial help if they agreed. The fact that none of those states followed his directive was one of his greatest disappointments as president. The Emancipation Proclamation was one of Lincoln's most brilliant strategies and one of his greatest gifts to America. It defined a high moral purpose for the war that helped unite Northerners and gained international support for the Union cause. And it paved the way for the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which 3 years later ended slavery in the United States once and for all. In 1863, there were 2 great Union victories in the Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg and 1 day later, the Battle of Vicksburg. People began to hope for an end to the fighting, but that end was still many more battles away. It was 1864 when Lincoln finally put Grant in charge of the Union forces, and from then on the Confederates were on the run. Grant led his men on a march towards Richmond, while meanwhile Union General William Sherman was making his famous march from Tennessee to Atlanta and then to the sea. There were still victories and defeats on both sides, and men were still dying by the thousands, but the North began to feel encouraged that it was only a matter of time until the South would have to surrender. With the South in the grips of Grant and Sherman, Lincoln was easily reelected to a second term in the presidency. In his second inaugural speech, he suggested that both the North and South, by God's will, had together been called on to pay the price for slavery. How long it would take to pay the price he didn't know, but he asked for his people's patience until, in his words, all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another's drawn with the sword. Lincoln himself had paid dearly. by an invisible sword that drew no less exacting an account. His health had been completely destroyed by the burden of the cares thrust upon him. He was as thin as a skeleton, and seldom able to stomach a complete meal. His eyes were sunken and rimmed with black circles. His face was deeply lined, and it forever wore an expression of haunting sadness. He didn't sleep well. He was subject to headaches and illnesses, and there was almost no recreation nor pleasure in his life, except an occasional trip to the theater. He had nightmares and disturbing dreams. In one he had seen himself walking through a silent White House towards the sound of sobbing. He entered the East Room, where he saw a coffin covered in black. He asked the guard on duty who was dead, and the soldier replied, "The President." On April 9, 1865, the South finally surrendered to the North at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Now Lincoln had a new task, to heal the wounds of his nation and reunite them in brotherhood. In his second inaugural address, only a month before, he had promised malice toward none and charity for all. Now he wasted no time in assuring the public that treatment of the states that had seceded would be generous and forgiving. In his last public speech he said, finding themselves safely at home, it would be utterly immaterial whether they had ever been abroad. The war was over. The business of rebuilding the United States was underway. The reelection had been won. There was time now, time to relax and celebrate. On Good Friday, April 14, 1865, Lincoln and Mary went to Ford's Theater in Washington to see a play called My American Cousin. Shortly after 10 o'clock, an actor named John Wilkes Booth, with a hatred for Negroes and a passion for the dead Confederacy, snuck up silently behind Lincoln in the presidential box and fired one shot into his head. Then he leapt to the stage, yelling, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, and fled into the night. Lincoln was carried unconscious across the street to a private home and laid upon a bed. Throughout the night his friends and family kept a vigil beside him, though the doctors had already pronounced the wound fatal. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He died the following morning, April 15th, at 7:22 a.m. at the age of 56. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing nearby, stated, "Now he belongs to the ages." The day after Lincoln's death became known as Black Easter. Millions of Americans grieved the loss of Lincoln as if they'd lost a father. Even his enemies spoke in praise of his courage and his selflessness. A train carried Lincoln's body west from Washington to Springfield, Illinois. All along its route, people gathered by the thousands, silently weeping as the man who had preserved the Union passed by and into history. Abraham Lincoln had been given leadership at the most critical and horrible moment in the nation's history. The Civil War is by far the bloodiest war in U.S. history. At Gettysburg alone, there were more casualties than all previous American wars put together. Lincoln confronted this crisis with great skill balanced with uncommon humanity. He was a superb strategist and leader, able to take effective control of a military that, without his guidance, would have suffered an inevitable and staggering defeat, able to raise the morale of his people, and able to clearly define the issues at stake and their broader significance. Many of his speeches and writings are among the most eloquent and classic statements of the ideals of democracy and of the United States of America ever made. In war, he was a genius. What he would have been in peace, we will never know. Abraham Lincoln was the first United States president to be assassinated, the first and perhaps the only one to become a true martyr to the cause of democracy. If not for Lincoln, today the United States would be two and possibly more nations. It would never have attained the prosperity, the growth, and the world prominence that now distinguishes it. Most importantly to him, it would not be standing as it does, as living proof that democracy can be an enduring and vital form of government. Lincoln never believed that what he accomplished had been accomplished without divine help and intervention. He once said, "I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me." He lived with a perpetual sense that he was being swept along by forces larger than himself, to a destiny he could and would not even dare to predict. If, as Shakespeare said, some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them, then Abraham Lincoln may be a rare example of all three. He had a natural strength of character and conviction. He worked diligently at improving his own mind and skills, and he was presented by fate with a challenge of such enormous proportions and implications that he himself believed he was nothing more and nothing less than an instrument in God's hands.